Well, good afternoon, and thanks again for having me here for this program timed with the observance of African American History Month. The theme nationally this year has to do with it being the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. In 1964, an act was passed that was in fact, a public law, 88-352, that represented a milestone in our national history. It had to do with the matter of civil rights. Civil rights, as Thomas Paine tells us, are those which appertain to man in right of his being a member of society. Now, of course, we'll acknowledge here the gendered nature of the language here, but what Paine was getting at, coming off of the French Revolution in the context of an emerging American Revolution, was that human beings have certain rights that are ours by virtue of being members of the society that we belong to. Whatever the social contract that brings us together into a civil society, there are certain rights that come with that. These were part of larger discussions going on in the world at that time around the natural rights of human beings. And natural rights are different from civil rights. Natural rights are those that inherit to you simply by virtue of being a human being, being born and a living being on this earth. There are certain human rights, but that are natural to a human being. But those civil rights, a little different, have to do with membership in society. And we then see that it took us a very long time in the United States, but to really figure out what are civil rights, who are entitled to those civil rights, and clearly one of the groups that had to fight a very long time in this country to ascertain their civil rights were those that were brought from the shores of Africa, that were brought here to be enslaved and to work to serve in this country in that capacity. The Civil War resolved that slavery was no longer tolerable in this country. And we moved to pass the 13th Amendment that ended that institution, except for imprisonment. This is the only case where we allow conditions of slavery to exist, as it were. But then there was also the 14th Amendment that had the Equal Protection Clause that guaranteed all persons the equal protection of the law. And then the 15th Amendment conferred voting rights. But despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we understand that the formerly enslaved people of this country had to continue to fight for their rights, had to fight against decisions of the Supreme Court, such as Plessy versus Ferguson, that declared separation of blacks from everyone else was legal, was constitutional. It took a very long time to overturn that. But that occurred in 1954 with the Supreme Court's reversal of its position in Brown versus Board of Education. But after the Brown, that there still needed to be more of a push than just the change of a Supreme Court's opinion. And so it took another 10 years of enormous sacrifice of a major social movement, social and political movement that we call today the Civil Rights Movement. But as Jacqueline Dowd Hall, professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, she challenges us to expand our concept of civil rights history through what she calls the long civil rights movement. And if we think then and so her argument goes toward dating the civil rights movement, not from 1954, but from earlier in our history. You could think of a long civil rights movement going back to after the Civil War, but in Dowd Hall's research, she really focuses on the emergence in the 1930s of civil rights activism and its organizing and connecting with labor movement emerging at that time, and how those working together lead us to the culmination or a certain a high point in civil rights history being the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this law and the provisions of the act forbade discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. The word sex was added at the last moment. Indeed, Representative Howard Smith, a Democrat of Virginia, added the word sex. His critics argued that Smith, who was a conservative Southern opponent of federal civil rights, put the word sex in there only to try and kill the entire bill. So after all this politicking, all this effort on the part of Lyndon Johnson, taking advantage of the changing mood of the country and where the country was, particularly after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of '63, taking advantage of all of what was going on in the country, as well as where the movement had gotten to with the March on Washington having come in August of 1963. All of that politicking, he inserted it as a last-minute attempt to try to derail support and to kill the whole bill. But his hope did not turn to pass, and that indeed we then see that a Democrat of Michigan, Martha Griffiths, led the effort to keep the word sex in the bill, and in the final legislation, Section 703 made it unlawful for an employer to, quote, fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his religion, and it did say his religion, sex, or national origin, or well as to limit compensation or terms, conditions, privileges of employment because of such individuals' race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And so the final bill allowed sex to be considered when sex is a bona fide occupational qualification for the job, but otherwise you're not to consider sex. Title VII of the Act created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to implement the law. So we first see the use then building up to this, the phrase affirmative action in an executive order that John F. Kennedy issued in 1961. But it was once the Equal Opportunity Commission was created by virtue of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, did you actually have anything beginning to take place around affirmative action. And indeed, even after the Civil Rights Act of '64, affirmative action was simply a phrase. It was simply a byword. The main requirement of it was that in posting all job ads, you had to note that you had to explicitly state that you are an equal opportunity employer. That was the requirement. That was what affirmative action effectively meant. We don't really begin to get action around actual policy and steps being taken, private or public sector, until into the '70s. And it was as a result of lawsuits that happened after the '64 Civil Rights Act, charging that people were in violation of the act. And so as courts began to find, and as the EEOC began to find against municipalities, public sector employers, as well as private sector employers, then there became a real push or affirmative action taken to try to set up timetables for change. And in some instances where the offenses were really egregious, the discrimination, pattern of discrimination really egregious, actual quotas. This year you will hire someone from the groups that you've been discriminating against, or else you'll be cut off from federal funding. So but coming forward now, 50 years from this act, we see that our EEOC collects millions of dollars in financial benefits for people who file claims of discrimination. I cite here a recent effort of a $34 million settlement in a sexual harassment case with Mitsubishi, resulting in the company's adoption of changes to its sexual harassment prevention policy. And also, and working with state local programs, the EEOC processes 48,000 claims annually. Now, I would say that what's important to understand in looking at, reflecting on this 50-year history of the Civil Rights Act is that we understand this was, while an important historical milestone, its work is unfinished. Its work has never been 100% triumphant, that it led to major political and social changes in this country and in our moving to become, as Barack Obama would put in the language of the Constitution, a more perfect union. It has led to a lot of progress, but we see that there was also, and from the time this was enacted, a lot of opposition, a lot of pushback against it, and that pushback continues down to this day, such that the EEOC, while it does process these claims, there are many, many of instances where it is not able to act at all, where it is not able to really lead to the kinds of changes we need as a society. So something more has to happen. I'd like to conclude this by just taking us through looking at one aspect of this history that I think is really poignant to consider. Some of the important leaders, cultural leaders, political leaders, particularly in terms of African Americans, were people for whom the definitions of heterosexuality, our definitions of sexuality were, they chafed under those standard or normative kinds of assumptions. Or if we wish to say, they chafed under the heterosexist nature of our culture. One of them, for example, is Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes' biographer, major biographer, won prizes for his work, is none other than Arnold Rampersad. Arnold Rampersad, in a 2-volume study of Hughes' life, what he raised is that Hughes paid in terms of in years of nomadic loneliness and a furtive sexuality for the nature of our culture and the nature of our own ideas of the civil rights of people who are not heterosexual. What about the civil rights of people who are not heterosexual? Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray is a very neglected figure of the civil rights struggle. Pauli Murray was became a lawyer, worked with many of the civil rights efforts. Her whole journey into civil rights activism began when she attempted to attend the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and was refused solely on the basis of her race. She was considered completely qualified to study there, but because of race, she was denied admission. And she continued to fight from there. She went on eventually to get a law degree from the University of California, Berkeley, Bolt Law School. And she, in doing her work there in legal studies, she looked at the laws around that of racial and other forms of discrimination from state to state. Her work was considered by Thurgood Marshall and others to be like the Bible of the civil rights litigative effort. She went state by state, looked at laws on the books that made it a crime if an African American didn't get off the sidewalk when a white person was passing by. She went state by state, looking at states and municipalities that had these kinds of racist ordinances. She went through looking at the ground of racial discrimination, legal discrimination in the laws around schools. Separation of schools, higher ed, community college, pre-K to 12. She went through looking at intermarriage, laws around forbidding intermarriage, state by state, racial intermarriage, and compiled these into a book that was published. Pauli Murray was also someone that never embraced an identity as a lesbian. However, she was known, and her biographers have made it known to us how she loved women. And she did have a brief period where she was married to a man, but most all of her life, her relationships were with women. She was a very close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt gave her quite a bit of support in her career and her work. In later years of her life, she became the first African-American Episcopal priest. A woman priest was into the priesthood. But her own words defining her sexuality, again in her biographers, is that she really felt that she was a man. She was a heterosexual man that happened to be in a woman's body. And that's how she defined it. But as in Langston Hughes' case, also in Pauli Murray's case, great deal of concern about losing respect, losing the ability to have influence, political influence amongst African Americans, if not the country as a whole, by coming out and identifying that I am not a heterosexual, I am not this, I'm not that. So limited herself quite a bit. Bayard Rustin. How many know that name? Bayard Rustin. Very important figure in the struggle for civil rights. Well before Martin Luther King, well before everyone. Like Pauli Murray, they were both founders of something called the Fellowship for Reconciliation. It was kind of a religiously based movement that was about challenging racial discrimination, Jim Crow segregation, racial laws. They would directly flout it, getting together in interracial groups and going into restaurants, going into areas where the accommodations were strictly segregated by race, and they wouldn't practice that. These were your original freedom riders. These were your original opponents, and they paid a heavy price. Pauli Murray was imprisoned for like a year for actions refusing to ride in the back of a bus, well before the 1950 bus boycott, Montgomery bus boycott, and Rosa Parks. It's 10 years or more before. In the case of Bayard Rustin, as part of the reconciliation, many times beaten, refusing to ride in the back of the bus, many times arrested, incarcerated. In one instance, he was incarcerated, however, for public indecency because he was with another man. Bayard Rustin never hid, never denied his homosexuality. However, he was also had to be very furtive about it. And he suffered a lot. Bayard Rustin was the actual architect of the March on Washington movement. He was with King as a consultant to him, came down on his own volition during the Montgomery bus boycott, offering to help King in organizing and getting the word out nationally so that they weren't just isolated there in Montgomery, Alabama, as they waged this campaign that stretched for over a year where African Americans didn't ride the bus. That they needed national, if they were going to make a real change, they needed national pressure, national eyes on this. And it was Rustin who helped to get that back during the Montgomery bus boycott. And he stayed with King and worked with King, but of course, somewhat marginalized because of both his homosexuality as well as he was a communist. He had left-wing leanings that were again, very problematic for the movement because the right-wingers were always saying this whole thing is a ploy of the Soviet Union. This whole thing is something just designed to hurt America by our enemies. So you had that issue. But he was such an important figure behind the movement, within the movement, but never got that recognition. In fact, Barack Obama posthumously, 2012, gave Bayard Rustin the National Medal of Honor for all that he did for this country. So a posthumous recognition. James Baldwin, another major figure of the civil rights movement, a major figure of literary culture around the world, in the United States, amongst African Americans, publishing his first major novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, his first novel in the 1940s. Rises, but finds life in this country, both as a black man, particularly as a black man, so stifling, he relocates to Paris, to France, and in other parts of the world. Turkey, lives around, but mostly in France. But comes back when the movement really quickens and really starts to cohere there in the 60s. Famous story of him that he was supposed to give an address at the March on Washington, but the Kennedy administration considered him a little too controversial and considered him someone who you couldn't control what he would say, and he might go off script and say something that the Kennedy administration didn't want said there. But Baldwin was nonetheless still very much a part of things. Here he is with Medgar Evers before Medgar Evers is assassinated in Mississippi. Here he is with Marlon Brando and Charleston Heston and Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier and many of the other celebrity figures who flocked to the movement and helped to support the movement. Here he is with some really grassroots young civil rights activists from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and demonstrations there. And of course here with Dr. King himself. Very important figure. His eloquence, his voice, his writing things like books like The Fire Next Time and whatnot that helped to capture and express what was going on in America, what was tearing us apart and what was needed in terms of real change, moral, deep cultural change. Gay man. He, of course, writes books like Giovanni's Room. That is considered in many ways one of the earliest pieces of gay literature that deals with, tells a story, both from the perspective of a European, a white man, actually. He's the narrator, and Baldwin is writing through that figure about his grappling with issues of sexuality. So never denied it, but it was never at the foreground. It was never something that he felt to try to politically organize around in the same way as he organized with respect to the civil rights movement. I finally conclude by bringing this up to the present with Michael Sam, star athlete at the University of Missouri, played in one of our ultimate male team competitive sports, football. And yet as he goes on this year to try to make a bid for a career in the NFL, he took that opportunity to state publicly, not knowing how it would affect his potential, his ability to be recruited to the NFL, the potential for what kind of money he could make in a career in the NFL. He said at that point he wanted to to come out and lay that out there. Not asking for special privileges, not asking for special, anything special from it, but just to say that I don't want to have to hide this, to be a part of this organization, to be an NFL football player. I don't want to have to hide this and let that then be something held against me. But it has set off such needed engagement with these issues for men, for straight men, for heterosexual men, and particularly for within the machismo culture of professional football, of the NFL. And we have yet to see where this takes us. But what I raise this is that this is beyond the law. This is beyond, but it still owes something to the legacy of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And hopefully, as we continue the ongoing journey of this unfinished revolution, that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was both a product of and an historical milestone. Let us hope that we can continue to advance toward a more perfect union where the civil rights of all are truly respected and safeguarded in this country. Thank you.